In our last video, we talked a little bit about the discovery of the cell, and then we discussed the cell theory, and we got a little bit into something called prokaryotes and eukaryotes. And the difference between those are essentially that prokaryotic cells are going to lack a nucleus. And there's some other big differences that we discussed, like the lack of organelles, the fact that they are going to be single-celled organisms, where eukaryotic cells are going to have a nucleus and they're going to have these things called organelles. So what we're going to get into today is we're going to talk about some specific organelles, and we're going to just discuss some of their functions. So let's get started. So first of all, you can have different types of eukaryotic cells. You can have plant, you can have animal cells. Bacteria are not going to be eukaryotic. They're going to be prokaryotic. They're more basic than the eukaryotic cells. So again, what is an organelle? An organelle just means it's bound in a membrane. So a membrane is just essentially a material. It's like the walls, right? It's something that contains something. So a membrane is containing something else. So in this case, the membrane is containing whatever is inside of this organelle. And they each have their own job. So there's going to be a bunch of different types of organelles. Just like in our body, we have multiple organs, right? Our heart is responsible for moving blood through our blood vessels. Our liver is responsible for making proteins and for digestion. We have, all these different organs have different jobs, and the same thing is true for our organelles. So the first we're going to talk about is actually, there's not a whole lot to say about it, but the cytoplasm. So the cytoplasm is basically, this is the space within the nucleus and the cell membrane of a cell. So it's essentially, it's the liquid that fills the cell. So if the cell was a water balloon, the cytoplasm would be the water. Now, it's not all water, but it's made up of mostly water. It has a bunch of proteins in there and some fats, and that gives it a jelly-like substance. So imagine, like, I think of it as like hand sanitizer, like a really thin jelly-like substance. And what that does is it allows for movement in the cell. So it gives the cell its shape, it provides the pressure inside to give the cell its shape, and it also allows for movement of things throughout the cell. So things like waste and amino acids to make proteins and things like that. So there's not a lot to say about the cytoplasm other than it is the space in between the cell membrane and the nucleus. It fills the cell, and its job is really to allow movement within the cell itself, and it's going to be found in plant and animal and bacteria cells. The next part of the cell has a little more going on, so we're going to spend a little longer with this. So that is the nucleus. And the nucleus you've all heard of before. They usually call it the brain of the cell, and that is not a great thing, I don't think. I don't like that term because it's not really deciding anything, and we're going to talk more about that as we go through. But what is the nucleus? Well, the nucleus is essentially a membrane-bound organelle in the cell. It's oftentimes one of the larger organelles in the cell, and this is where the DNA is stored. So the nucleus is not really a brain, it's more of a safe. It protects the DNA. So the DNA is the instructions on how to make all the proteins that exist in the organism. So every protein that gets made in that organism, the instructions are in that DNA. And that DNA is stored inside the nucleus, and that is to protect it. It would be like if I gave you a bunch of money, right? If I handed you $100,000 and you couldn't use it right away, you're not going to just throw it on the floor. You're going to put it somewhere safe. You're going to hide it. You're going to put it somewhere where nobody can get to it. Well, your DNA is the same way. And that's the big difference between eukaryotes and prokaryotes. Eukaryotes have a nucleus, and that DNA is protected. It's harder to manipulate it. It's harder to mutate it. Where in prokaryotes, it is not protected in a nucleus, and it's much easier to get mutated. That's why bacteria changes so much. And it's surrounded by something called the nuclear envelope. So in this diagram here, this would be the nucleus, and the nuclear envelope is basically the membrane that is around the nucleus. So it's the membrane that protects the DNA. It also has these little holes called nuclear pores, and they allow things to leave, right? So for example, your DNA has instructions on how to make proteins, and then that instruction is going to get sent to another part of the cell, and that goes out through and that is called RNA. We're going to learn more about that later on. Your DNA gets copied into RNA, and that's like a messenger, and that can leave the nucleus by going through those nuclear pores. The next term you need to know is nucleolus, and the nucleolus is inside of the nucleus. So if I go back to this diagram here, actually, you can see this is the nucleolus right here. So this would be the nucleus, and inside the nucleus is the nucleolus. And what the nucleolus is it's basically just a specialized region of the nucleus. There's DNA in there. That's not where all the DNA is, but that's where some of the DNA is, and that is where ribosomes get made. So the main job of the nucleolus, as far as we're concerned, is that is where ribosomes get made. And we're going to talk more about ribosomes a little later on. And the last two things that we're going to mention about the nucleus has to do with what's inside of it, and that is the DNA. So DNA, that's the instructions on how to make a protein. But here's the thing about that. It's really long. We have billions and billions, 3 billion base pairs is what they say. So it's a really long molecule. It's actually 3 meters long, which if you take 3 meter sticks and line them up, you know, it's really long. So take your arms and spread them as far apart as you can go, and then probably go at least another half a distance of that. That's how long your DNA is. So we got to somehow fit this inside this microscopic nucleus. And the way that's done is by folding it, right? So imagine if we went, I said, all right, guys, we're going to take a class trip. And we're going to go on a big trip. And I want you to pack all your clothes. And we're going to go on this trip for a week. But you got to pack it into this little tiny container. Can you fit all those clothes into this container? Well, no, you obviously can't. But if you wanted to, you're going to have to fold them up really tight to get them in there. That is essentially how DNA fits into the nucleus. It gets folded up really tight, and it gets folded up into this form called chromatin or chromatin. I've heard it said both ways. I'm going to say chromatin. So chromatin is what DNA is when it's not dividing, and essentially it just wraps around itself, and it looks like a tangled up mess, and it's just all these, because it's a stranded molecule. We're going to talk more about that later on, and it just wraps around itself into this jumbled up mess that is going to be something that can be fit inside of the nucleus, right? Now, whenever the cell is going to divide and split into two new cells, what has to happen is the DNA has to get copied. So it changes its form into something called a chromosome. So it goes from chromatin to a chromosome. And the reason why it does that is it allows it to split easier. So when I show you this next diagram, I think this will hopefully help you to understand. So what you're seeing here is this. Would you agree with me that this looks like a bowl of spaghetti or like ramen noodles? Well, that's exactly what it looks like. Well, that is how chromatin is. It's a big tangled up mess. All the DNA is just packed in there so it can fit. But whenever this cell is ready to divide, it starts to consolidate itself, essentially. It wraps tighter, and it wraps into these X-shaped structures called chromosomes. Now, if you take a look at it, imagine trying to split that in half. Well, that would be near impossible. It's a big mess. But now this you could split in half rather easily because you just, one half goes to one side, one half goes to the other. And that is called a chromosome. It's the same material, it's just organized better so it can divide. So chromatin and chromosomes are both DNA. It's just two different forms of it. Chromatin is when it's going to not be dividing, so it can fit inside the nucleus. And then whenever that cell's ready to divide, the nucleus actually goes away. We're going to talk about that later. It dissolves, and the chromosomes form. All that messy chromatin, it condenses into chromosomes, and then those chromosomes can split. I'm going to finish up with a little bit more. Okay, the next one is the ribosomes. And ribosomes are really important. Ribosomes are protein factories. This is where the proteins get made. So this is a picture of some ribosomes, and they just look like little dots, right? And that's because they're so tiny that even our most powerful microscope can only pick up that they're little tiny dots. This is what they would look like if you were to do not an animation, but an image of the actual molecule itself. So it's pretty complex. But what they are they're small particles of something called RNA. And RNA is like DNA. It's very similar to DNA, but it's a copy of it. And we're going to talk more about that later on. And they're found inside the cytoplasm. So you're going to find ribosomes just kind of floating around the cytoplasm. They get made in the nucleolus, and then they get sent out into the cytoplasm. And eventually they make their way to something called the endoplasmic reticulum, which we're going to talk about later. And they attach themselves to it. They kind of just hang out there. But their job is extremely important. They read the DNA and they make proteins. So if I were to say what's the job of your cell's job is most likely to make some kind of protein. Some of those proteins get used in the cell, but a lot of times they get used outside of the cell. Like, for example, your hair cells make hair, which is a type of protein. So they get rid of that protein. It leaves the cell through your hair follicle. And the way that these proteins get made is the ribosomes actually read the DNA, and then they assemble the amino acids into the correct order to make the protein the way it's supposed to get made. And we're going to talk all about how that happens later on in the year. So that is going to be the first set of organelles that we're going to be talking about. Thank you very much.